All right, guys, I had a little bit of luck last week, so I actually picked up an antelope tag in the state of Nevada as part of the secondary draw. So I applied in the first draw, I was unfortunate, didn't draw, stayed with it, applied in the second draw, and I actually picked up an archery antelope tag in Nevada. I try to pick up an archery antelope tag every single year. They've pretty quickly become one of my very favorite species to hunt. And if I don't have an archery antelope tag in my pocket, I get pretty bummed out. So I was very fortunate and lucky and excited to find out that I'd drawn that tag. So with that, I thought I would do a video on how I scout for antelope. Now, I'm going to speak specifically to archery antelope, but it certainly applies to those rifle hunts as well. Most states across the West are going to have rifle hunts that are in that August, September time frame. Really kind of the middle of the rut, if you will. Antelope pretty typically rut in September, maybe the end of August, but you're really looking at that time frame from August to maybe middle of September for most pronghorn antelope hunts throughout the West. If you're familiar with antelope at all, you probably know that one of the key factors for their habitat is water. They're an arid dwelling species, not a lot of rain. They get some moisture from the vegetation they eat, but they're pretty reliant on water, and they're most often found in and around water sources. So for me, one of the very first steps that I start with antelope scouting, e-scouting, is water. I'm looking for water. So I'm going to run you through kind of my process of how I scout for antelope and likely antelope areas, and then specifically water holes, because I do like to hunt out of a blind for antelope. I really enjoy that time in the blind. I read books. I get some time to think. I get to watch antelope be antelope up close, and I also get to be pretty selective in the buck I harvest. So water is really, really important to me. So with that, I'm going to dive in and just show you how I e-scout for antelope. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to roll over here to the library. I'm going to scroll down and find the state that I'm interested in. So like I just said, I drew a tag in the state of Nevada. I'm going to click on Nevada. Underneath that, I have the options for the different layers I can add. So one of the first layers I often add is the hunt units, because I want to be able to distinguish very quickly on my map when I'm looking at it, the units that are available to me that are under the permit that I drew. So I'm going to actually click that. You can play with the transparency of those if you want to. I'm just going to leave it as is right now. Government land. So I'm going to click on government land. I'm going to highlight and make the government land, that's your public land, your Forest Service, your BLM, your state lands. I'm going to make those available so that I can see those. After that, one of the layers that I like to add is the private land, because I want to know who owns the private land. I want to know where it's at in relation to the public land. And sometimes, depending on the state that you're hunting in, you may be able to hunt some of that private land. If it's not posted, you want to definitely dig into the rules and regs and be clear on what is available to you and what isn't. But I do like to turn on that private land layer so that I'm aware where the private land is and who the private land owners are. A few years ago, I had a tag in the state of Utah. I got myself into a situation where I had a buck on private land. I was able to find out who the private landowner was. I got to go out and talk to that guy. I got permission to hunt that area. I didn't ultimately end up hunting it. I ended up hunting public and killed a great buck, but that was available to me just by utilizing maps and finding out who the landowner was and then just knocking on a door and having a conversation. So I do like to know where the private land is. One of the next things that I will typically add is your roads and trails. If you've ever been out west, you've hunted antelope before, you need roads and trails. You need to understand where those are at, because a big portion of hunting pronghorn in the West is covering ground, driving, glassing, and repeat. It's not uncommon to put a lot of miles on your truck when you're out pronghorn hunting and scouting. So I do want to know where those are at. So I'm just going to pull up and hit the trails layer and also the motorized roads and trails layer so that I know what roads are available to me. Then I'm going to scroll down. You see right here in this state of Nevada, you've got a species distribution map. Now this is information that's provided by the state. It may be interesting to you depending on the species that you're hunting. I'm going to click on antelope distribution. I'm also going to click on antelope movement corridors, because those are both applicable to me. Now when I start to scroll in, I might find that just the bulk of the map is completely covered and it doesn't offer me a lot of information. So you got to kind of play with that, but it is a layer that I like to turn on before I really get going, just to know where the distribution is, where the travel corridors might be. And every state's different. They may not offer that information, or they may, like the state of Nevada here does, so I'm going to turn that layer on. Terrain, as I scroll down here, I could highlight the elevation range, and depending on the units that I was hunting, I could pretty quickly eliminate a lot of the terrain that antelope are not likely to be in. Antelope are mostly low valley dwelling grassland sage steppe animals. So I could use that if I wanted to kind of eliminate a bunch of areas if I was hunting areas that had some high elevation stuff that they weren't likely to be in. For the units that I've got, I'm not going to turn that on because it's not super applicable to me. And then down here is probably one of the most important layers, and that's your water layer. So in Nevada, I've got guzzlers, I've got rivers and streams, I've got springs. So I'm going to turn all three of those on. Now that's not going to have every single water source that is in any given unit, because there's a lot of stock ponds, cattle ponds, maybe some seeps that aren't available. But I do want to turn those on just in case, because those are going to be areas that I want to look at for antelope. So basically, I've got all my different layers on, and now I can start to scroll in. Now as I scroll in here, you can see that I've got these big pink areas. Now those are my distribution areas. So like I said, depending on the areas, I scroll in and I look at these, it may completely cover the whole area, and it might not offer me a lot of intel. So I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to turn that off. It is kind of nice as you get into some of these other areas though. You'll see, okay, I've got some distribution areas here that I can kind of point to. I'm like, okay, those are, you know, probably likely areas. So that is interesting to me. Just for the sake of this video, I'm actually going to turn it off so I can kind of see through these. So I'm going to go back to my library. I'm going to scroll back to Nevada. I'm going to find the species distribution, and I could make that opaque so that I can kind of see through it if I wanted to. Not a bad idea, or I could completely turn it off. So I'm going to actually just turn that off. You can see how that shows up on the map if I turn it on and off. Antelope movement areas. Yeah, I can see some of those as well right here. So that's interesting to me. So I might leave that one on. So basically I've got some outlines here. I've got some ideas already on where I might find antelope in the area. Now the next step is really kind of monotonous, to be honest. Basically what you're going to do is you're just going to zoom in and you're going to start cruising these areas looking for water sources. And it can get pretty meticulous because you do have to zoom in close enough. One of the tips I would give you when you're looking at aerial imagery and you're cruising the landscape looking for water sources is often you will see these big, almost wagon wheels with spokes. And as you're looking at that aerial imagery, what you're looking at is cattle trails typically. So livestock that are grazing on BLM lands, and they're coming into a central water hole, whether it's a stock pond or a tank. But as I'm cruising aerial imagery, I'm always looking for those big wagon wheel type shapes where you've got those dirt trails that are going to a central water source. So basically, I'm just going to cruise these areas. I'm going to look for those trails that are leading to a water source, and as I'm kind of just hovering and looking, zooming in, zooming out, as soon as I find something that I think looks interesting to me, maybe I find a water hole. As I'm cruising right here, I'm not seeing any, but I am seeing some creeks, which is interesting. But basically what I'm doing, I'm looking for water holes. I'm looking for those patterns in the landscape. See, this is kind of interesting here. I'm starting to see some game trails here. It might be cattle that are trailing into a water source. I'm starting to see those right here. Lots and lots of trails. So I'm just following those down to try to find a central point. And bingo, here I go. So right here, I can scroll in and I can see that right on this little pocket right here, I've got a water hole. Now I can zoom out and I can see if that's on private or public. It looks like this one might be just inside a private piece, but it doesn't mean that you might not get some antelope that are drifting. Actually, it looks like it's just on the outside. Yeah, so basically I just drop a waypoint on that water hole. Over here, I'm going to go to the edit portion. I like to turn my water hole icon blue so that it's very apparent as I start to zoom out from the map. and I'm just gonna hit save. So that's gonna save it as water hole. I could name it if I wanted to, but essentially that's what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back, I'm just gonna cruise all my available landscape based on species distribution layers and really focus in on finding water. I'm gonna try to find those guzzlers and label them. And pretty soon, what I'll have done is I'll have built this map that as you zoom out, you can see all the different water holes. And as you start to see those water holes, you can pretty well guarantee that you'll find antelope in those areas. Now, once I get out on the ground, you know, if I've got some days to scout, I will cruise the roads and I will start with those icons and those waypoints that I've dropped on water holes, and I'm going to start glassing for antelope because most often they're going to be within a couple miles of those water sources. I'm going to drive out, I'm going to check those individual water sources. I'm going to walk around them, I'm going to look for antelope tracks. Obviously, I'm looking for other people's blinds to see if maybe they've already staked claim on that water hole. I'm looking for trail cameras. I'm just looking for sign that there might be some antelope. And then obviously, as you're driving and you're glassing, you're starting to pick up antelope and see those. Oftentimes, when I'm out there driving around, I'll find antelope and I may not have a water source mapped close to them. At that point, it's a great time to pull out your phone and start to cruise the area at the point you're at. You're kind of seeing those antelope and starting to figure out where those water sources are that those goats are watering on, because they are hitting water somewhere in the vicinity of that. All right, one other tip I would offer you for finding antelope is the topography. So I think you can pull up topo maps. Typically not a ton of topography and a lot of antelope habitat, but in the west, like Nevada, even some areas of Wyoming, Utah, you may be able to find those high points, those glassing points, by using a topographic map. I talked about an earlier video, but basically a topographic map is a series of contour lines that kind of show you the outline of the environment. And it's great for highlighting high points that you might be able to climb up on and actually do some glassing. The other thing you can use is the analysis tool. So this terrain analysis tool, where you could highlight elevation, you could evaluate the topography. It is great for eliminating elevation ranges. So if you want to try to find the high points in your area that are adjacent to that flat country where those antelope are, you could use this terrain analysis to do that, which is pretty dang handy. And you can do that by dragging these layers back and forth to kind of highlight the elevation that's most interesting to you. So if you're scouting for antelope, look for water, but definitely don't skimp on finding glassing points, finding those little knobs that are just give you just enough elevation that you can get up above those valley floors and really scan those with your optics. So that's kind of my process. One final tip that I'll give you is I like to often compare the historical imagery. Now, we have historical imagery in our maps. Depending on where you're looking, it may not be super detailed. It may not give you a wide range. So what I like to do is I like to also pull up Google Earth, and I will compare Google Earth with our maps, and I will look at the historical imagery. I'll go back in time. I'll compare water holes that might be dry on our maps or dry on their maps to look to see if they're holding some water. I'll look at the year, I'll look at the time of year that those have water in them. I might go back and compare the water year that they had on the year I'm looking at for the historical imagery, and just kind of get an idea if that water hole is likely to hold some water this year that I've got a permit. So that's my process. Basically roads, trails, private, public, species distribution layers, and water, and really just grinding and spending your time on maps and just dropping waypoints, layering those waypoints up for water sources, and just really starting to pick it apart. E-scouting is typically not my favorite. I don't spend a ton of time e-scouting for elk, maybe some for mule deer, but for antelope, I spend an absolute ton of time e-scouting for antelope, and it's mostly tied to water and dropping waypoints on water points. So hopefully that helps you out. That's the process. It's just a lot of scanning, it's a lot of looking, it's a lot of evaluating the landscape. But I'm super excited to have an antelope tag. I hope a bunch of you have antelope tags this year, whether it's archery or rifle, maybe even some muzzleloader opportunities. But I think you follow some of these tips, you spend your time on maps, scouting for water holes and scouting for antelope, I think it'll pay dividends when you get out into the fall. For me, that hunt starts in a month, actually less than a month. So it's time for me to get to work, dropping waypoints, doing some scouting, and then hopefully I'll get a chance to get out and harvest a great buck in Nevada. If you got questions, drop them in the comments below. If I missed something, obviously I've said this before, I'd love to hear any tips or tricks that you have. But with that, do some scouting, get out, and let's get after some antelope.